morning, everyone. My name is Jelena Vasiljevich from the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory. I'm here to announce our first keynote lecture, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Rogers Brubaker, who hardly needs any introduction. Rogers Brubaker is Professor of Sociology at the University of California in Los Angeles and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, one of the world's leading scholar of ethnicity, nationalism, and citizenship. And we all read and were influenced by his many acclaimed books like Citizenship and Nationhood in France and Germany, Nationalism Reframed, Nationhood and the National Question in the New Europe, Ethnicity Without Groups, Grounds for Difference, a book that came out last year, which we had immense pleasure to discuss yesterday afternoon with Professor Brubaker and other colleagues. So without further ado, I want to announce the talk, which is entitled Religious Dimensions of Political Conflict and Violence. So the title is a bit different from the one you have in your programs. So please welcome Professor Rogers Brubaker.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Jelena, and thanks to you and your colleagues for this invitation. Let me make two preliminary remarks about my talk this morning. The first is that my talk is not about conflict in the former Yugoslavia. It's a theoretical talk. It has no particular reference to this part of the world. The second preliminary remark is that I will be concerned, as you can guess from the title, with the category religion, not with the category nation. And yet, I don't think the talk is entirely irrelevant to the subject of this conference. That is, religion is, among other things, an imagined community in the same way that nation is. And aspects of the problematic of religious conflict and violence, which I'll be addressing, have fairly close parallels, of course, as well as intertwinings with aspects of the problematics of ethnic and national conflict and violence. Thus, while in a sense my talk will stand on the margins of your conference, I hope it's not going to be irrelevant to the discussions at this conference. And precisely the themes that were highlighted in these interesting opening remarks, that is the tension between the politics of enmity and the politics of friendship or solidarity. Obviously, that same tension is found in the domain of religion and religious politics. So let me then, without further ado, address this subject. The question of the religious dimensions of political conflict and violence, of course, is today a question that's hard to escape. It's especially hard to escape in the sphere of journalism and public discussion, but it's also an increasingly prominent question in the social sciences. On the one hand, political scientists, who are, after all, specialists in the study of conflict and violence, yet who were long strikingly uninterested in religious phenomena, have more recently found religion with a vengeance in the last decade or so, while specialists, on the other hand, in the study of religion, sociologists, anthropologists, historians, and others, have become increasingly interested in conflict and violence. So you have a kind of convergence, and the reasons for this convergence are obvious. Both developments were responding to the resurgence of what Jose Casanova has called public religion, that is, politically active and contentious forms of religious engagement, in a range of settings in which religion had previously long been prevailingly understood as a private matter. More specifically, of course, shifting intellectual agendas in the social sciences reflect the shock of the Iranian Revolution, the rise of politically active fundamentalist movements in all major religious traditions, and, of course, the prominent implication of religion in a series of civil wars and terrorist campaigns. And the question of the religious dimensions of political conflict and violence continues to insist itself into relevance, brought into focus by headlines with depressing regularity, although one should note that Western news coverage tends to dwell on violence in the West while giving comparatively scant and superficial attention to the vastly larger scale carnage and violence produced by religiously grounded or religiously informed conflicts elsewhere in the world. So how should we understand the religious dimensions of political conflict and political violence? This is the question I want to reflect on with you this morning. There are two broad ways of thinking about this. One view, and I'll call this the particularizing view, sees religiously grounded conflict and violence as sui generis, as having a distinctive, indeed a unique causal logic or texture. This view takes religious claims seriously, maybe too seriously. Now, the alternative view, I'm going to call this the generalizing view, is that what appears on the surface to be religiously inspired conflict and violence can best be subsumed under a broader heading, a broader rubric, under the notion of political conflict and violence in general, or perhaps under the abstract rubric of politicized ethnicity, including, of course, nationalism. So on the second view, religious claims may mask other, more important causal factors. Religion is at best incidental to the logic or causal texture of conflict or violence. Now, in my view, these two views need not be mutually exclusive. We can bring into analytical focus both the distinctiveness of religiously informed political conflict, on the one hand, and the ways in which many conflicts that involve religiously identified claimants or parties are fundamentally similar in structure and dynamics and stakes and even content to conflicts involving other culturally or ethnically defined claimants. So I'm going to begin with the generalizing view, the view that there's nothing really distinctively religious about what appears to be religious conflict and violence. But then I'm going to go on and devote most of my talk to specifying some distinctive ways in which religion can be implicated in political conflict and violence. That is, to the second view, the more particularizing view. And I'm doing this not because I think this particularizing approach, this approach that takes religious claims more seriously, is superior to the generalizing approach, but rather because it's less well developed. That is, the generalizing stance, the one that subsumes religion under a broader heading of political conflict and violence in general, or under the heading of politicized ethnicity, this generalizing stance is clear. It's well defined. The particularizing stance is much less clear. And the strongest and clearest particularizing theories or statements, those that propose the strongest forms of religious exceptionalism, that is the view that there's something special about religion, the strongest statements of that view are simply untenable. So the challenge that I'm going to address today is to develop a more nuanced account of the distinctive ways in which religion can enter into political conflict and violence. So how can religion, whatever we mean by religion, enter into political conflict and violence? It's this how question that I'm trying to answer today. Now, there's an objection that can be made to this whole analytical strategy, and namely, the objection is that religion and religious are hopelessly inadequate analytical categories. They are better understood as categories of practice, and indeed as essentially contested categories of practice. So on this understanding, religion as such does not exist. At least we as social scientists can't even say what religion is. Rather, what exists in practice and what may contribute to enable or justify political violence in certain contexts, what exists are particular practices, particular discourses, particular structures that are understood by some practitioners as religious, even when, in some cases, their religious legitimacy may be vehemently denied by others who claim religious authority. So I'm very sympathetic to this critique, and I acknowledge that a fuller and more rigorous treatment of this topic would have to avoid using religion or religious as categories of analysis, or at least be much more self-reflexive, self-critical about defining and using these categories. But this is an exploratory discussion, and I'm willing to work here with a relatively casual and imprecise notion of religion, as long as we keep in mind that what I mean by religion or religious is not any kind of unitary thing, but a loosely related set of practices and discourses and structures for which someone claims religious sanction. That is, for which some practitioners claim religious sanction or interpret in religious terms. So let me begin then with the generalizing view, that is the view that treats religion as simply one of a number of functionally equivalent bases of identity and mobilization. This view developed in the context of the study of ethnicity, and I want to distinguish here two strands of work. The first goes back to the late Frederick Barth's influential introduction to a volume that many of you will know, the volume Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, published a half-century ago. Here, Barth called for redirecting attention from observable patterns of shared culture to the categorical distinctions that organize and channel social interaction. The nature and dynamics of such boundaries, for all a boundary was for Barth, is a kind of categorical distinction that organizes interaction. The nature and dynamics of such boundaries, according to Barth, could be studied without regard to what he somewhat dismissively and to his later regret referred to as the cultural stuff, that is, the patterns of cultural similarity and difference. So in Barth's words, the critical focus of investigation becomes the ethnic boundary that defines the group, not the cultural stuff that it encloses. The second strand of work emerged a bit later from efforts in the 70s and 80s to make sense of the surge of political mobilization on the basis of putatively primordial identities: language, race, religion, caste, tribe, or indigeneity. Now, of course, I'm saying these were putatively primordial, not actually primordial. Ethnicity was constituted as an object of study in this line of work by abstracting from the specificities of language, from the specificities of religion, from the specificities of other ascriptive markers such as phenotype, region of origin, customary mode of livelihood, and so on, and by reducing all of these to their common denominator, their abstract common denominator, as markers of identity and difference and bases of solidarity. Now, Joseph Rothschild was one of the most sophisticated proponents of this line of work, and in this setting, it's worth remarking that he was also one of the most sophisticated analysts of East Central European society and politics. According to Rothschild, it would be pointless to, and I quote here, to separate out the notion of ethnic consciousness, solidarity, and assertiveness from religious, linguistic, racial, or other so-called primordial foci of consciousness, assertiveness, and solidarity. If this were to be done, he continued, it's difficult to see what precisely would be meant by the residual notion of ethnicity and ethnic groups. That is, if you worked on the one hand with race and then religion and language and tribe and indigeneity, what's left for ethnicity? So instead, ethnicity becomes this common denominator for all of these notions. And according to Rothschild then, whether political entrepreneurs mobilize along the lines of religion or language or race just doesn't matter. It's intrinsically irrelevant, Rothschild wrote, since any and every one of these can be sacralized, note the religious language, sacralized into a symbolic focus of ethnic mobilization and politicization. And this process, again I'm quoting from Rothschild, this process is more or less the same whichever marker criterion is selected. So the Barthian study of ethnic boundaries on the one hand, and the political science study of politicized ethnicity developed initially independently of one another, though they have subsequently come together. Barth and his immediate followers were concerned with social organization, while the political scientists were concerned with political mobilization and claims making, but both lines of work treated ethnicity as a culturally empty form. That is, both lines of work discounted culture. What mattered was not how difference and identity were culturally constructed, but rather how they were socially organized and politically instrumentalized or expressed. So in this tradition, in this line of work, this religion gets subsumed along with race, caste, kinship, language, indigeneity, nationality, and so on. Religion gets subsumed under the abstract, culturally empty rubric of ethnicity. Religion never comes into focus in this analytical tradition. The work doesn't start with politicized religion and then make a case for subsuming it under a broader notion or theoretical rubric. Rather, the work starts with ethnicity, which it defines very broadly enough to embrace religion along with these other markers. So religion is never really at the center of analytical attention. So now in the remainder of my lecture, I'm going to start not with this culturally empty notion of ethnicity, but I want to start with politicized religion. And I want to consider some possibly distinctive ways in which religion can inform and inflect, shape political conflict. I'm going to do this in two steps. First, I'm going to consider how religion can help define the stakes of a conflict, that is, what people are fighting about. And secondly, how religion can shape the modalities and mechanisms of conflict. So let me start with the stakes of conflict. But I want to begin by noting that the stakes of conflict that might seem to be religious are not always, in fact, religious. So conflicts involving religiously labeled or identified parties or claimants need not involve religiously defined stakes. That is, they may be conflicts over political power, economic resources, symbolic recognition, cultural reproduction, or national self-determination. And this, of course, is what makes it possible and fruitful to subsume religion for certain purposes under the heading of politicized ethnicity or nationalism. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, the parties to the conflict may be identified as Catholics and Protestants, but the stakes of the conflict are not religious. And of course, the same holds for the conflict here in the former Yugoslavia between Muslims, Orthodox Serbs, and Catholic Croats. And to a considerable extent, this holds also for contemporary conflicts between parties labeled as Shiites and Sunnis in Iraq and elsewhere, or between Alawites and Sunnis in Syria, although in these contemporary cases, one can see both ethnopolitical conflicts or ethno-national conflicts over who owns the state, as my former colleague Andreas Wimmer put it, and we can also see conflicts with distinctively religious stakes, pitting some religiously militant Sunnis, for example, against other Sunnis and against Shiites and Alawites and so on. But in other contexts, one cannot assimilate religious to ethnopolitical conflict. One can't subsume religious under this heading of ethnopolitical conflict. And here I want to distinguish the boundary defining or group constituting aspects of religion, the way religion can be used to simply label and identify parties to a conflict. I want to distinguish that boundary defining or group constituting aspect from the normative ordering power intrinsic to many forms of religious discourse. The boundary defining aspect, or group constituting aspect, is what allows religion to be treated for certain purposes as a form of politicized ethnicity. But the normative ordering power of religion points to the distinctively religious stakes of certain political conflicts. So I want to say a word now about this normative ordering power and how it can generate distinctively religious stakes of political conflicts. Religious understandings of what I will call right order exist on a variety of different levels: personal, familial, communal, societal, and even cosmic. And in many traditions of demanding or serious religiosity, forms of right order or of disorder at these various levels are understood to be closely interconnected. So, for example, common to what you can loosely call fundamentalist currents in many religious traditions is the argument that disorder in the family contributes to disorder in the wider communal, societal, and political spheres. And this That is, this notion that the various levels are interconnected and that disorder in one level contributes to disorder in another level. This helps explain the priority accorded in these fundamentalist traditions to restoring right order in the sphere of family and sexuality, and to countering, for example, the alleged evils of feminism, of unregulated sexuality, of divorce, of lack of respect for paternal or husbandly authority. Now, political projects and claims like these, which arise from distinctively religious understandings of right order, can't be subsumed under a paradigm of politicized ethnicity. And this is not because of the intensity of the conflict. Ethnic and nationalist conflicts, of course, can be just as intense. It's because conflict turns on the question of how we should live, not just on the questions of recognition, resources, and opportunities for cultural reproduction that are central to politicized ethnicity and nationalism. So ethnic and national identities may be just as deeply felt as religious identities, but they are normatively thin. And by that I mean they have few implications for the substantive regulation of personal or familial or public life, for the question how we should live. Today, the most salient religiously driven political conflicts over the substantive regulation of public life turn on claims for the implementation of Sharia, which have been central to political contestation throughout much of the Muslim world since the 1970s. What anthropologist Robert Hefner has called Sharia politics, and that is struggles over the meaning and place and authority of Sharia in society. Such struggles assume widely varying forms, as do understandings of what Sharia means in contemporary contexts, but the regulation of gender and sexuality and family is almost always at stake in such conflicts, as are questions of religious freedom and relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. Outside the Muslim world, religiously driven political conflicts likewise pivot on the regulation of gender, sexuality, and the family. So in the United States, for example, conflicts over the substantive regulation of public life arise from the Christian right's efforts to ban abortion, to prohibit gay marriage, to restrict access to contraception, to restore school prayer, and to require the teaching of creationism or intelligent design in schools. And similar conflicts arise from ultra-Orthodox Jewish claims in Israel that buses not operate on Saturdays, that sex segregation be observed in public spaces in their neighborhoods, that sex-segregated bus lines serve their communities, and that sex segregation be preserved at the Western Wall. Now, of course, religion is not the only source of claims about the right ordering of public life. The exhaustion of communism and fascism indeed reduced the salience of conflict driven by comprehensive secular ideological commitments, but moral crusades, social movements, and other forms of political contestation continue to be driven by secular as well as religiously informed moral commitments and understandings of right order. But religion remains a distinctively comprehensive and durable source of politically relevant understandings of right order, and this potent normative ordering power is what distinguishes conflicts with distinctively religious stakes from ethnopolitical and ethno-national conflicts between parties who might be identified in religious terms, with religious labels. Now, I've suggested that some forms of political conflict involve distinctively religious stakes, while others do not, even when the parties are labeled in religious terms. For the rest of my lecture, I want now to suggest some ways in which religiously informed political conflict and violence, and from now on I'm going to be focusing on violent conflict, can be sustained by a distinctive matrix of modalities and mechanisms. So I'm going to identify and comment on 6 modalities and mechanisms. I want to itemize them in advance just to give you a sense of where I'm going. So the first will be the social production of what I call hyper-committed selves. The second is the cognitive and affective construction of extreme otherhood and urgent threat. The third is the mobilization of specifically religious rewards, sanctions, justifications, obligations, and ultimate meanings. The fourth is the experience of profanation. The fifth is the translocal expandability of conflict. And the last is the incentives generated by what I call decentralized and hyper-competitive religious fields. I want to note two caveats about this set of modalities and mechanisms. First, it's not a systematic typology. It's in no sense an exhaustive list of mechanisms. It's exploratory, it's illustrative. And secondly, these are not specific. These are not 6 specific mechanisms. Rather, each of these 6 designates a broad class of modalities, mechanisms, and processes. And I'm not attached to the notion of mechanism per se, which may be a little bit too mechanistic. You might just as well say processes or modalities. So let me begin with the first mechanism, which is what I call the social production of hypercommitted selves. By hypercommitted selves, I mean selves constituted by the radical and uncompromising commitment to a political, moral, or religious cause. The cause is understood as an unconditional and absolute value, not as one good thing among others. This is the stance that Max Weber famously called a Gesinnungsethik, an ethic of conviction or ethic of ultimate ends. That kind of stance, the ethic of conviction, is characterized by indifference to the consequences of action as illustrated, and this is Weber, as illustrated by the maxim, the Christian acts rightly and leaves the outcomes to God. This is from Weber's famous lecture, The Politics as a Vocation. Now, of course, hypercommitment need not entail violence. The cause to which one is committed may even expressly repudiate violence. But there is an affinity between hypercommitment and intransigence or violence. The indifference to consequences can facilitate both the suffering of violence and the inflicting of violence. How does it do so? It does so by suspending ordinary forms of moral accounting, by suspending the everyday sensitivity to risk and harm in the name of an overriding concern with the one thing that matters. At the limit, this may entail indifference to the possibility or even to the certainty of one's own death, or indifference to the deaths of others. This discounting of consequences is the source of the extreme moral ambivalence of hypercommitment, which can enable both self-sacrificing forms of moral heroism and self-righteous forms of morally sanctified violence. And this is a theme that will run throughout my talk here, that is the ambivalence. It's the same as we see with the category nation. That is this ambivalence that in the introductory remarks was commented on. Nation in connection with enmity, or nation in connection with solidarity and emancipation and autonomy. So, now, there's of course nothing uniquely religious about radical and uncompromising commitment to a cause. The paradigmatic ethic of conviction for Max Weber was indeed religious, but in his great lecture, Politics as a Vocation, delivered in January 1919 during the turmoil of the November Revolution, Weber was more concerned with secular forms, and specifically with revolutionary syndicalism. And of course, all high-risk secular collective action requires commitment. It requires participants to discount risks. Still, religion's formidable socializing and world-defining powers make it a distinctively robust and productive, fertile source of hypercommitted selves. The power to transform selves, to transform subjectivities, to define reality, comes into focus most clearly in the case of conversion to a new and more demanding form of religious engagement. Now, by conversion, I don't necessarily mean conversion from one religious category or affiliation to another, but rather from one often merely nominal mode of religious engagement, or even non-engagement, to another mode of engagement, a more demanding mode of engagement. Conversion, in this sense, often involves a fundamental shift in identity. It involves the sense of being born again, of starting one's life anew. It can involve a rupture in ways of seeing and experiencing the world, a relativization and devaluation of existing social ties, a powerful cognitive, emotional, moral, and even bodily re-socialization. Now, obviously, certain secular organizations and movements also employ techniques of resocialization in their efforts to produce highly committed members, and commitment can intensify and crystallize in the course of ongoing struggles, but religion is a particularly potent matrix of the profound reorganization of the self. Now, of course, conversion doesn't always produce a hyper-committed self. Religious commitment shades over into hyper-commitment only at the extreme endpoint of a continuum, but the logic of what Max Weber called heroic religiosity or virtuoso religiosity, a logic premised on an implicitly comparative and competitive frame within which claims can be made for exceptional status on the basis of exceptional religious performance. This is what makes hypercommitment an ever-recurring possibility. And when hypercommitment is generated, it can contribute to uncompromising, high-risk, and sometimes violent forms of political action. All right, let me turn to the second mechanism now, which is the construction of extreme otherhood and urgent threat. Again, of course, this is a generic social and cultural and political process. It's not distinctively religious. And while religion is implicated in the construction of otherhood, it's also involved in transcending divisions and constructing universalistic forms of solidarity. And here again, one sees what R. Scott Appleby has called the ambivalence of the sacred, which in a sense parallels the ambivalence of the nation. Yet religion affords a distinctively potent, flexible, authoritative, renewable, transposable, and mutually reinforcing set of resources that are at once symbolic, discursive, ritual, and organizational for constructing extreme forms of otherhood that can facilitate and legitimize violence. Because religion is, among other things, an authoritative system of classification, and many religious traditions then contain specifically religious categories of extreme otherhood: heretic, apostate, infidel, and so on. Many religious traditions specify procedures such as excommunication, or in the Muslim world, takfir, for placing persons in these categories of extreme others. And they justify and authorize violence in certain contexts against members of these categories. Of course, all religious traditions are internally contradictory, and justifications for violence stand in tension with other provisions, but categories of religiously legitimated extreme otherhood and justifications for violence against such others remain available as potent discursive resource. Religious traditions also contain elaborate and distinctive resources for constructing urgent threats and for mobilizing and legitimizing action against them. Idioms of sacralization and profanation, idioms of cosmological good and evil, idioms of divinely sanctioned mission or holy war, idioms of imminent catastrophe or millenarian transformation can be enlisted to raise the stakes. Judgments pronounced by religious authorities can enjoin action, including violent action, to respond to the threat. And here, by religious authorities, of course, I mean not only mainstream authorities, but also, and today especially, all those who claim to speak with religious authority, even when their authority is rejected by the overwhelming majority of mainstream religious authorities. And I'm going to say more about that problem of authority in a moment. More generally, religious understandings of transcendent reality offer powerful leverage for radically devaluing the existing social and political order and for legitimizing programs of radical reconstruction which may encourage or require violence. Michael Walzer, for example, famously characterized Puritanism as the template for all forms of social revolution, while Shmuel Eisenstadt traced the origin of what he called totalistic or Jacobin forms of radical politics to the transposition of transcendental religious visions generated in axial age civilizations from restricted and marginal spaces into the center of politics. More generally still, the charismatic or prophetic moment in religion, like charismatic authority in general, is intrinsically disruptive and even revolutionary, as Max Weber argued. And it's no accident here that both Michael Walzer and Shmuel Eisenstadt were deeply influenced by Max Weber. Now, of course, religious understandings of transcendent reality can also be mobilized against challenges to the existing social and political order. They can be used to legitimize the violent repression of challenges and of challengers. Let me move now to the third mechanism, and this is the mobilization of rewards, sanctions, justifications, obligations, and what might be called deep, ultimate, or constitutive meanings. This, too, is a generic social process, but religious entrepreneurs and organizations, or political entrepreneurs who speak sincerely or insincerely the language of religion, may be able to mobilize an additional layer of rewards, sanctions, obligations, and ultimate meanings. This is suggested most clearly by the spectacular surge in the last 15 years in religiously legitimated or rationalized suicide attacks. As political scientists have correctly pointed out, specifically religious rewards and justifications are neither necessary for the recruitment of suicide attackers, and this was shown by the anti-religious Tamil Tigers' extensive use of the technique. They were pioneers in this technique, nor sufficient. That is, religious rewards and justifications are certainly not sufficient to produce the use of this technique, and this is shown by the fact that suicide attacks are overwhelmingly concentrated in a very small number of theaters of conflict. But religious justifications can and do transform such attacks from religiously prohibited suicide into religiously sanctioned martyrdom, rewarded in the afterlife, where the sins of the martyr who has died for the sake of God will be washed away. Now, martyrdom has become, in certain contexts, a secular category, and in some settings, notably in Israel and the occupied territories and Lebanon, strong social support for suicide bombers has led to their celebration as secular heroes. So this is a specifically secular form of martyrdom. But while suicide bombing in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been intensively studied, that conflict accounts for a very, very small fraction of post-2000 attacks, about 4%. If Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, where more than 80% of post-2000 attacks have occurred, specifically religious rewards for martyrdom would appear to count for much more in recruitment, especially in Pakistan and post-2011 Iraq, where suicide bombing does not involve the struggle against foreign occupation that political scientists have emphasized. So political scientists tend to discount such religious rewards and justifications. For most political scientists, religion provides at best an ex post rationalization and justification of conduct that can be explained perfectly well in non-religious terms. Now, I agree that if our aim is to explain organizational strategies, the strategies adopted by a violence-wielding organization, then one should be skeptical about the language of religion. But if our aim is to understand why individuals are willing to volunteer for such suicide missions, then it seems to me harder to dismiss religion. That is, the rationality and the intelligibility of suicide bombing for organizations is one thing, but its rationality and intelligibility for individuals who volunteer to sacrifice themselves is another thing. The religious legitimations that may serve as an ex post rationalization or a justification for organizations may operate as ex ante motivations for individuals, or at least as forms of sense-making, forms of meaning-making that give suicide missions a larger meaning and purpose. So what is, on the one hand, opportunistically and maybe even cynically employed by organizations may be deeply and sincerely felt by individual recruits. Okay, let me turn then to the fourth mechanism, which is the experience of profanation. If one takes the categories sacred and profane in a broad Durkheimian sense, then sacred objects are simply those that are set apart, objects that must be treated with special respect. And profanation is simply an experienced or claimed violation of that required respect. And this profanation in the broadest sense in the form of perceived disrespect towards special objects, places, or activities, this can generate a violent response in many contexts that are not substantively religious. But I'm interested here in profanation in a narrower and more substantively religious sense. So in this sense, violence can be provoked by deliberate attempts to desecrate the central symbols of another religion, such as Florida pastor Terry Jones's burning of a Quran in March of 2011. But a religious profanation can also be experienced even if it's not intended as a provocation. So this need not lead to violence. Outraged at a perceived profanation may be channeled into peaceful protests or into institutional politics, but sometimes it takes extra institutional and violent forms, as in the threats to Salman Rushdie's life and the bombing of bookstores after the publication of the Satanic Verses, such as the riots in response to the cartoons famously published by the Danish newspaper 10 years ago, and of course in the Charlie Hebdo massacre of last year. The fifth mechanism concerns the translocal expandability of violent religious conflict. Religion, as I noted at the outset, is a powerful form of imagined community that cuts across state boundaries, and as such, religion can serve as a vector of conflict expansion. The most spectacular recent instance of this has involved the participation of large numbers of Muslim foreign fighters in Afghanistan, in Bosnia, in Iraq, and especially in Syria. I want to note 5 things about this mobilization. The first is its global, rather than merely regional nature. The second is the bottom-up mobilization of foreign fighters, which distinguishes their participation from state-led transborder interventions, though of course there are now massive state-led transborder interventions in Syria. But before that, there were massive bottom-up participation. The third is the salience of ideal rather than material interests. And at least in the earlier stages of the Syrian conflict, most foreign fighters were not paid, at least not very much, and they could not expect opportunities for looting, for example, that have motivated other forms of transborder military adventurism. The fourth thing that I want to highlight about this translocal expandability is the discursive framing of transborder fighting as an individual religious obligation by certain influential clerics, invoking the classical distinction in Islamic jurisprudence between matters that are obligatory for each Muslim individually and those that are obligatory for the community of believers as a whole. Now, this is the position of only a very small minority of Muslim clerics, and it's repudiated by the great majority, but nonetheless, this clerical sanction, even if extremely minoritarian, has helped to motivate and legitimate the participation of those who are, in any event, already receptive to the pan-Islamist discourse that highlights the urgent existential threat faced by the global Muslim Ummah. And the last aspect of contemporary foreign fighter involvement that I want to note is the willingness to fight rather than simply contribute financially at a safe distance. And this distinguishes foreign fighters from ethnic diaspora financial support for distant nationalist movements and insurgencies such as the Tamil Tigers or the PKK in Kurdistan or the IRA. Collect money in the bars of New York, which then ends up going to the IRA. So, in short, this contemporary mobilization of foreign fighters draws on a deeply, though of course unevenly felt, sense of personal religious obligation to defend the global imagined community of the Ummah against a vividly felt existential threat. Which isn't to say, of course, that there aren't other motivations, a sense of adventure, a sense of political resentment, and so on, but that element of personal religious motivation is also there. Okay, let me turn now to the sixth and last mechanism that I want to discuss, and that is the structure of religious fields. My argument here is that decentralized and hyper-competitive religious fields can generate structural incentives for radicalization that can foster intransigent and sometimes violent religious and political action. This was true of the post-Reformation wars of religion in 16th and 17th century Europe, and a similar dynamic is at work today in the fragmented and hyper-competitive field of contemporary Sunni Islam. The religious field of Sunni Islam has always been decentralized, but fragmentation and struggles over authority have intensified in the last half century as mass education and new media is very important here, have undermined the authority of the traditionally educated ulama, the legal scholars, and created space for large numbers of new interpreters to claim the right to speak in the name of Islam. In the theoretical language of Pierre Bourdieu, fields generate incentives for different kinds of position taking for those in different positions in those fields. So those who possess very little or none of the most traditional, the most consecrated forms of field-specific capital, so this would be in the field of Sunni Islam, those who have none of the deep jurisprudential knowledge, none of that deep religious knowledge that characterized the ulama, these people, without those consecrated forms of cultural capital, they seek to valorize new forms of capital. So they are structurally disposed or inclined towards heteronomy, that is, towards opening up the religious field to forms of capital, principles of valuation derived from other fields. So not jurisprudential knowledge, but rather political capital or even military capital or the capital of notoriety or fame or media exposure on the other. And these new entrants in fields, they are structurally disposed also towards strategies of outbidding, in which they can claim to be more truly Islamic than others, and towards strategies of provocation intended to gain visibility and recognition. Again, this mechanism is not specifically religious. New entrants to all fields, not just religious ones. You could think of artistic fields, for example. New entrants to artistic fields are disposed to strategies of heteronomy, outbidding, and provocation, trying to gain visibility, etc. Precisely because they lack those consecrated forms of field-specific capital, they seek to valorize new forms of capital. But in the fragmented, hyper-competitive field of Sunni Islam, with no structures in place for the authoritative regulation or moderation of internal conflict and competition, these general structural tendencies are greatly accepted. And then you have structural incentives for heteronomy, provocation, and outbidding in the religious field, which align with structural incentives for heteronomy in the political field. So this is the case in parts of the Middle East today, where regimes have been defined in the last half century or so by a twofold process of exclusion, which is at once religious on the part of repressively secularist nationalist regimes, so religious exclusion, but also then ethno-religious exclusion on the part of substantively ethnocratic regimes. So you throw into the mix then what can be represented as the neo-imperial involvement of Christian powers, and you get strong incentives then to religionize political competition and conflict, that is, to frame political questions in religious terms, and to use religious language as an instrument of political mobilization. So in this setting, there are few and ineffective political and institutional arrangements to protect politics from religion, just as there are few and ineffective mechanisms to protect religion from politics, and specifically to protect religion from getting entangled in struggles over control over the means of violence. So let me conclude. None of the modalities and mechanisms I've discussed is unique to religion, but religion provides a distinctively rich and interlocking matrix of modalities and mechanisms. It can define reality, it can constitute communities, it can nurture powerful emotions, it can generate commitment, it can re-socialize and reorganize the self, it can radically devalue the existing social and political order, it can impose obligations, it can offer rewards and sanctions, it can furnish justifications, it can intensify threats and dangers. It links cognitive definitions of ultimate reality with structures of feeling and obligation, and in so doing, it can authorize, legitimate, enable, or even require violent action in the face of urgent threat, in the face of profanations of sacred symbols, in the face of extreme otherhood. Now, the fact that religion can do this does, of course, not mean that it will do this. And the very same mechanisms that can enable religiously informed political conflict to turn violent can also enable powerful forms of nonviolent, solidaristic, or humanitarian social action. The social production of hyper-committed selves can nurture moral heroism. The construction of urgent threats can radically delegitimize social evils such as exploitation or slavery or even war itself. Transnational religion can serve as a vector of expansion of humanitarian campaigns such as the anti-slavery movement in the 19th century. And the fragmented and hyper-competitive religious field may generate stances, and I think here of the Quakers, may generate stances that categorically reject violence. So there's no intrinsic connection between religion and political violence. But religion does provide a potent assemblage or mix of moral, ideological, and organizational resources that in certain contexts can inform, legitimate, or sustain violent conflict, just as in other contexts they can inform, legitimate, or sustain the most admirable forms of moral and political engagement. So the analytical challenge for students of conflict and violence is to specify the conditions and contexts in which particular religious practices, particular discourses, particular religious fields, particular organizations, particular structures of sentiment can contribute to the production, reproduction, and transformation of conflict and violence. And obviously taking up that challenge is beyond the scope of this lecture. Doing so would require a different mode of analysis, at once historical, comparative, and contextual, geared toward specifying when, where, how, and why the modalities, mechanisms, and dynamics that I have outlined are activated in ways that play into political conflict and violence. Thank you very much.